Good afternoon. Good to be here. So as Bennett said, I'm going to be talking about reclaiming formative assessment and very much building on some of the things that we were seeing there in the video and also before lunch. So I'm actually going to start us off with a little thought activity, thinking about formative assessment. I'm going to ask us to think about something outside of education to begin with. I want us to think about marathon running. So some nice pictures up there to get you in the mood. So imagine that you wanted to run a marathon. Imagine that you hadn't run one before, so you were starting from quite a low baseline. And imagine that you wanted to track your progress towards your goal. And let's imagine you had, say, 3 or 4 months from starting to running the marathon. What might you do and how might you measure your progress towards that final goal? So I'm actually going to go out to you for, I'll give you about a minute to talk about this in pairs. And then I'll call you back together, and we'll see what people think. So a little chance to have a bit of discussion about that. If you wanted to run a marathon, what would be the best way that you'd measure the progress towards your goal? Off you go. Okay, all right, I'll bring you back together. If we come back together, I can't see everyone very well, but does anyone want to volunteer? Anything that they would like to say? Any ways that you would measure your progress towards the goal? Yeah.
We were saying it's quite complicated. The first thing would be that you'd want to manage a particular distance before you started looking at time.
Yeah.
That if you can run for 10 minutes without falling over.
Yeah, yeah. So you probably wouldn't start with running the 26 miles. You might run for 10 minutes and see how far you could do. Yeah, great. Other suggestions? What might you do? Stop smoking. Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
It depends on the purpose of your running. You're running for the speed. Maybe mirrors the speed progress day by day. If you just keep your fitness, you mirror your body physical indicators. How you done it.
Great. So it depends to an extent on why you've chosen to run the marathon. If you've chosen to run it for general fitness, or if you're choosing to run it that you really want to beat a certain speed or a certain time. Stop smoking. I like that one. That's definitely a good suggestion. So I think you get the point. I'm sure you came up with other ideas too, but you get the flavour of what I'm trying to do. So what I'm going to do now is I'll show you some of the ideas that I come up with. I've put some sensible ideas up here and also some less sensible ideas, which I hope you would have some agreement with. So I've said downloading a plan, having a plan is often a good idea, sticking to the plan. And actually someone said to me recently, stick to the plan. Actually, sometimes you want to adjust the plan if based on the feedback you're getting from some of your sessions. You would start with some shorter runs and build up distance. You probably wouldn't start with 26 miles. You might do some speed work if your focus is on getting faster. You might spend some time in the gym, and you might monitor your improvements on all of those things. And I haven't put up there about nutrition or diet or those kind of things too, but you could add that in, sleep quality, smoking, the amount you drink. You could monitor all various sorts of things around that. And indeed, lots of amateur runners do exactly those things. And elite runners too. Elite runners don't just run marathons in their training session. Elite runners do a lot of those things as well, and will track a whole range of metrics. Some things you probably wouldn't do, whether you were starting out or indeed even if you were an elite runner, is you wouldn't run a marathon in every training session, and you wouldn't expect that you would measure your progress towards the final goal simply by looking at your times on a marathon. That would be absurd. It would also probably, whatever your stage, lead to injury and quite possibly demotivation. So the reason I start with this is I think this provides a very good analogy, a very good framework for thinking about educational assessment. Because my argument is that in UK schools over the last few years, we have done the equivalent of expecting pupils to run marathons in every lesson. And I think how that's manifested itself is in the overuse of past papers, the overuse of techniques like teaching to the test, and it's led to also the overuse of grades. So by the overuse of grades, what I mean is I'm going to show you some examples. So my argument is that overusing grades is like running too many marathons. These kind of things. So I've got a few screenshots here of slides from lessons, the kind of the starter or the plenary activity in lessons that are all based around trying to come up with a grade. And certainly when I trained to teach, this was seen as good practice. This was the way you set up a lesson. So by the end of this lesson, I want to meet the band whatever outcome by the end of the lesson. By the end of this lesson, I'll have been given the opportunity to achieve a level 3, a level 4, a level 5. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to produce a description at level 3, level 4, level 5. And again there, another one. By the end of this lesson, 4, 5, 6. And it is not hard to find lots of examples of lessons like this, all on the basis of, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to get a certain grade. And my argument is that expecting to get a grade at the end of every lesson is like expecting to run a marathon in every training session. It's not actually going to give you a good idea of the progress that you're making. And perhaps even worse than that, it's going to crowd out other really valuable activities that can't be graded, and that or to take my marathon analogy, that couldn't be measured as a marathon time. So for example, lots of marathon runners will spend a bit of time in the gym doing some weights, doing some stretching. You would not expect to measure the weights they lifted as a fraction of a marathon time. And my argument is there's lots of activities you can do that are extremely valuable, that are measurable, but they are not measurable as grades or as fractions of grades. And again, another thing that was common when I began teaching was the idea that we would have level 3, 4, and 5, and the way we would measure progress in between those was simply to break 3, 4, and 5 down into ever finer stages. So you had, first of all, level 3A, 3B, 3C, and then you had some people who were trying to subdivide that into even further increments. And my argument with that is it's not that you do need to measure finer degrees of progress, but you need a different metric, a different currency. It's a different activity. So let me give an example of that in the academic sense. Some activities just can't be graded. Really valuable activities. They can be measured, but they can't be graded. So, for example, if you teach a pupil the meaning of a new word, I hope we can all agree that that would be depending on the word and the subject, but we can agree that teaching a pupil a new word can be a valuable activity that can lead to them learning more. Does that move them up a grade? Does it move them from a grade 4 to a grade 5 at GCSE? Does it move them from a level working towards or an expected standard? It doesn't. And it can't even be measured as an increment of those metrics. It is something different. So it can be measured, but it has to be measured on a different scale. And this is why I want to take a slight detour to talk about this, and then we'll come back to talking about this measurement and how we measure. But I want to talk about what is deliberate practice. And the reason I want to talk about deliberate practice is I think it gives us a really good angle on what we should be measuring when we measure formatively, as opposed to what we should be measuring when we measure summatively. So the difference between what I think we should be doing when we look at formative and summative. So I'm going to speak a little bit about deliberate practice, and then return to this formative assessment point and how we measure formative assessment. So I've put 2 books up there. One is by Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers. So just to show of hands, who's read Outliers or heard of Outliers? Okay, great. Who's heard of the 10,000 hours rule? Okay, great. So the 10,000 hours rule, Gladwell popularised, he came up with this phrase in his book, Outliers. And put simply, his idea, what he talked about in the book is that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to get good at something. So he's looking at what does it take to become good at something. And he came up with this idea that was based on the research of other people, which I'll talk about in a moment, that you need 10,000 hours to get good at something. 10,000 hours of practice. And he based that idea on the research of someone else, on the research of K. Anders Ericsson. And I've put up Ericsson's latest book here, Peak, How to Master Anything. Ericsson is perhaps the world expert in expertise. He spent a life researching what it takes to become expert. And he does indeed say that it takes thousands of hours of practice to become an expert. He's looked at experts in music, in lots of different sports, in chess, in a whole different range of fields. And he does indeed say that it takes thousands of hours to get good at something. But he adds a nuance, which I think is missing in Gladwell's book, is that he says the type of practice you need to get good at something, it's not any old practice. It isn't just doing the same thing over and over. He says it's deliberate practice. And what is deliberate practice? Let's have a look. The quotation is there at the bottom bullet point. He opposes deliberate practice to naive practice. So he says naive practice is just doing something over and over. Deliberate practice is about putting a bunch of baby steps together to reach a longer term goal. So that's obviously a simpler way of putting it. He's got lots more research where he goes into it in depth, but that's essentially the point. Naive practice is doing the same thing over and over. Deliberate practice is you break down the thing, whatever it is you want to get good at, into the chunks, into the baby steps, and you practice those. And again, he looks at a whole range of experts, and that's the way that they become experts in these complex fields. And I hope you can see, again, to return to that marathon analogy, the similarity with that even elite marathon runners who are capable of running for 26 miles don't do so in every training session. They break down the complex skill of marathon running into smaller chunks, and they're honing those individual chunks. So that's the distinction between them, and I think that was something that was lost in Gladwell's popularisation of the theory. I think Gladwell really put it forward as any kind of practice makes perfect. And there was a really good podcast, actually, where someone got the two of them together, Gladwell and Ericsson, and they got them to discuss this point. And they clashed over exactly this. And in Outliers, Gladwell talks about the Beatles. And he gives an example of the Beatles as having their 10,000 hours of practice. He says it's the time they spent playing concerts in Hamburg as young men. That they played all these concerts, they played sort of consecutive nights of concerts, and this was the practice that made perfection. And actually, Ericsson says, no, that's not deliberate practice. That's performance. That's the thing. He says, actually, the deliberate practice that honed the Beatles' skill was, his example is Lennon and McCartney sitting in each other's bedrooms and picking out chords and playing little bits over and over and coming up with ideas for new songs. He says that's the deliberate practice. And so I think this distinction between deliberate practice and naive practice is absolutely crucial, because I think too often in education we assume that simply doing a complex skill will make you get better at it, and it won't. And another example from everyday life is driving. Most people plateau as drivers after a couple of years, even though you keep logging, in some cases, hours and hours and hours of driving practice. After a couple of years, you plateau. And the reason that you plateau is you're not doing that deliberate practice. You're just repeating the driving. You're not focusing on small steps and incremental improvements and of ways to improve. So that's an example from everyday life where I think we can see that just adding hours doesn't necessarily make you better. So what I want to do now is give a few examples of how this might apply in a whole range of fields. So what is deliberate practice? I've got some examples here. So there's a series of examples. I'll go through them and pick out a couple that I particularly would like to talk about. And actually, I'll just, while you've got that as well, just remind us of the definition that we've got there on the right-hand side. So learning to read. I think when you look at young children in primary and they learn to read, I've put in brackets there, Read, Write, Ink. It's a really good phonics program, but it's a way of breaking down that complex skill of reading into smaller chunks, that pupils have to learn that letter-sound correspondence before they can decode text. And I think that's also an interesting one, because when you see children practicing those letter-sound correspondences, doing their speed sounds, often what they're doing, it doesn't look like reading. And I think that's one of the reasons why phonics programs, people can sometimes feel uneasy about them, is they think, well, it's not reading, it's not real books. But in essence, that's the point. That's what Ericsson would say is deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is not authentic. That's again, one of the insights from Ericsson's work. Learning maths, and again, that's why practicing times tables can be important, because it's giving you that chance to practice something that you're going to be able to use again and again, and to get it to be fluent. And again, it's that idea of Ericsson saying that it's a smaller chunk of a lot of bigger problems. Learning science, I've put an example there. I'm going to skip to the learning to write accurately, because it's one that's close to my heart. I was an English secondary teacher. A lot of the work I do now is on writing assessment, and I really do feel, particularly with writing, we expect pupils to learn to write by doing writing. We expect them almost, as I say to the marathon analogy, like expecting someone to learn to run a marathon by running a marathon. And actually, writing is a phenomenally complex mental skill. And the research on writing is fascinating because the research we've done shows it's one of the most complex and effortful of all mental skills. And when you get people engaged in writing text, it's as complex as chess players engaged in middle game moves. That you have to be really absorbed and really concentrate to be able to write well. And one of the programs I really like, which teaches writing, which I think teaches writing rather than ask people just to do writing, is a program called Expressive Writing. And it has a number of activities, some of which look very simple, a lot of which don't look like writing. They don't involve writing whole texts. And one of my favourites involves the use of pronouns. It's activities around pronouns. The pupils practice editing a passage to remove all of the ambiguous pronouns. And the reason why I think that's such a great activity is because I remember a few years ago doing an analysis of some pupils' GCSE scripts and pupils' school I was teaching at then, and they were all pupils who had got B's and C's, and we'd expected them to get A's and A stars. We called in some of their scripts and looked at their writing. And we found a few common sort of errors cropping up across their scripts, but one of the really persistent ones was this. It was ambiguous pronouns. It was that they were using words like they, this, and that, and you had no idea who they were referring to. And again, if you look at the research on writing, those kind of syntactic ties, like pronouns, are the markers which allow you to construct an argument and to construct coherence. So pronouns have this really vital role in establishing argument and establishing coherence and establishing a logical chain of thought. And too often, a lot of pupils, particularly if they're writing, not got much time, they're using these pronouns and it isn't clear who they're referring to. And expressive writing has this wonderful activity, there's a series of them, they build up, that allow you to address that and focus on that, and focus on just that, with the aim of making it automatic, so that when you come to write, it's automatic to be thinking about the pronoun and who that pronoun is referring to. So that's a nice example. Learning history, a thing we often think about in history is we want our pupils to have a chronological awareness. And again, I can remember talking to people I taught in a form group once, asking them about their essay on the Battle of Hastings. They said to me, Miss, they said, William, Harold, his troops were so tired when they got to Hastings because they'd had to march all the way from Stamford Bridge. He said, why didn't they just get the train? And what was really fascinating about it is he was really proud of himself because he hadn't said, why didn't they drive? So, he'd done enough. He thought, he knew a car was a new technology, but he'd assumed, oh, well, it's in the past, so a train, why didn't they get a train? And so what that pupil was lacking, I think, in a superficial sense, you might say, well, they're lacking chronological awareness. I think the more interesting question is, how do you develop that chronological awareness? What does it take to get there? And I think there is a role there, again, in having a framework, memorising a framework of not just dates of big events and battles, but actually of things like the invention of the railway or the development of different forms of communication and technology. And if pupils have that schema in their heads, that allows them to slot in new information and new dates that they hear about within that schema. And I put a couple in here that aren't really school subjects, but learning chess, Ericsson writes quite a bit about this, so do a lot of the other research in this field, but chess experts don't play chess over and over. They will practice, often they'll memorise openings, but they'll also practice end games. And learning football, again, this is similar to the marathon analogy, but if you watch any group of footballers train, be they young children or professional elite footballers, they often will start their training sessions, they won't be playing a full 11-a-side game. They'll do lots and lots of passing drills. And again, that's what Eric's talking about the decomposition of skill into its component chunks. But what is the basic skill, the most fundamental skill that underpins playing football? It is the pass. It underpins everything. So that's why footballers practice the pass so much, to an extent that if you watch a lot of football training sessions, it can become quite banal, but it's clearly important. So that's a little tour of deliberate practice. And I think this has enormous implications for formative assessment. Because I think if we accept, therefore, that a complex skill is something that can be broken down into smaller chunks and that practicing those smaller chunks is helpful, that, as I say, has enormous implications. So I think we should use deliberate practice. We should break down those skills into those chunks. And I think, as I say, this has big implications for formative and summative assessment. So let's look at some of them. So formative assessment, it's assessment for learning. The aim is to provide helpful next steps. So the aim is to get some kind of feedback loop established where you are finding things out about what the small things that a pupil can or can't do that you can then work on and hone and improve. So the idea is that you can break down the complex skill and isolate the parts, because that will let you see where the strength or weakness is. And again, one of the issues we had, I talked about the pupils whose scripts we recalled. One of the issues we had in working out what had happened or what had gone wrong is it's such a complex task that they're doing, and writing, as I've said, is one of the most complex mental tasks. It can be difficult to work out exactly what the issue is. And that's the problem with all complex tasks, of identifying what's the exact component here that I need to focus on. So another thing Erickson says is that when you break it down into smaller steps, it makes it easier to see where the issues are, and it also makes it much easier to give feedback. So one of the problems I used to face when marking essays where there were lots of errors is if you mark them all, the pupil will get completely overwhelmed. Quite aside from any effect of demoralisation, they'll be completely overwhelmed. They won't be able to handle so much information in one go. If you don't mark them all, the risk is they assume that what they're doing is right, and they get into some bad habits. So the solution to that dilemma is to start with the smaller chunks. So when you're building up to the complex chunk, you don't have as many errors to correct. And so I would say for formative assessment, don't use grades, because grades are designed to measure performance on the complex skill. So I would argue we shouldn't be grading more than twice a year. That would be my argument. But with formative assessment, we can measure it, we just don't measure it with grades, but we should be measuring it frequently. And in fact, in some of the programs I've mentioned there, like Read, Write, Inc. or Expressive Writing, they're set up with just the kind of whole class questioning that Lucy talked about in her video, which is that sort of instant feedback and instant questioning and real-time information in the questions. And in fact, I know particularly with early years pupils, some of the teachers I've spoken to, they will say they won't want to go more than 15 seconds or 30 seconds without some feedback. So in that sense, using it frequently, how frequently? It can be as frequent as 30 seconds, that you're constantly getting that feedback and constantly adapting what you do based on that. So that would be how I see formative assessment working. And summative assessment, I think, is quite different. And I think you need different tasks for different purposes. And so that it's not just that they have different purposes, it's that I think the different purpose should lead to some different tasks. Because with summative assessment, we are trying to get an assessment of learning. The aim with summative assessment, I would argue, is to get an accurate shared meaning. And that's why we use grades, because grades essentially are a means of communicating something shared, that when we use the language of a grade in the classroom, it's very misleading if we're saying to our pupils, this is a grade 4, this is a grade 5. If that grade, those grades have a national meaning. And if we use them in a way that isn't synced up to that national meaning, that's very confusing. So the aim of a grade is to get that accurate shared meaning. And summative assessment is measuring complex skills that are difficult and are formed of many subcomponents. And it is the right thing to be measuring that complex skill at that stage. But again, I would say don't overdo it, don't do it too frequently. And I think once or twice a year is fine for that. What I see happening a lot, which I think has happened a lot partly because of the accountability system in England, is that people are overusing summative assessments. So I was an English teacher, but even now I see it, schools using mock exams, in some cases in every couple of months, to try and measure their pupils' progress. And my argument would be that if you could break down what are the skills that it takes to get better at the tasks in that mock, if we focus on those, that's a better way of both learning and of measuring the progress. Okay, so if we need to measure formative and summative progress separately, that would be my argument. My argument would be we measure them separately and we measure them with different currencies or different metrics. So how should we do so? And about 5 years ago now, national curriculum levels were abolished in England, and that's led to a lot of schools and a lot of teachers developing their own assessment systems. And I would say one of the really common ways of assessing is through the use of prose descriptors. So through the use of statements of achievement or of standards, which teachers then try and match their pupils up against. So what I want to give an example of now is of one of those, of these prose descriptors, of whether they are effective either at the formative or at the summative purpose. So as I say, let's have a go. Let's analyse prose descriptors against these main purposes. So I've said I've looked at formative, where I think the aim is to get the helpful next steps. The summative, the aim is to get a shared meaning. How helpful are prose descriptors at achieving these goals? So by prose descriptors, I mean things like the old national curriculum levels, or indeed the GCSE mark schemes, the rubrics. So let's have a look. Okay, so let's have a look at this one here. So here is a descriptor. It should be here, hang on. Yeah, here we go. Can compare two fractions to identify which is larger. So that's a statement that's a kind of prose descriptor which I think many schools in England now, they're assessing their pupils against. And I've deliberately picked a descriptor here that I think you'll agree is quite tightly defined. So can compare two fractions to see which is larger. There's not too much ambiguity in that statement. And there's three questions on the left there, which are all, I think, again, we would agree, legitimate interpretations of that descriptor. But on the right, you can see the success rates of those different questions. And you can see that the first question, this is for 14-year-olds in England, and 90% of pupils, of 14-year-olds get that first question right. 75% get the second one right, and only 15% get the final one right. So I think the great problem we have here is that I can imagine that there are teachers who are trying to assess or rag rate, maybe, their pupils against that statement, and that one of them gives their children the first question and says, fantastic, my children have done this, they've all passed, we can move on. Another teacher gives them the second question and thinks, oh, there's a bit of ambiguity, I need to reteach a few things, but we're basically okay. And the third teacher thinks, oh my goodness, my pupils have no idea about fractions, I need to reteach the whole unit. And in actual fact, those three classes could be working at the same level. So the great problem with prose descriptors like this is that even ones that are quite tightly defined are capable of being interpreted in ways that will make a big impact on how difficult the pupils find them. And if that's a problem with a tightly defined descriptor in a subject like maths, how much more of a problem is that going to be in a subject like English? I can remember dealing with some descriptors that were like, can use vocabulary with originality and flair. So if we're struggling to interpret that precisely, how much more are we going to struggle with some of the descriptors we get in English, in the humanities, which really are, and again, you can end up in those horrible situations where you spend moderation meetings sort of parsing the difference between original, accurate, effectively, and playing a sort of adverb soup. So I think that's the issue with descriptors being used to give a shared meaning. And that would be, I would say, one of the problems with national curriculum levels. And we thought that national curriculum levels gave us a shared language, but actually my argument would be they gave us something more dangerous. They gave us the illusion of a shared language, that we had schools up and down the country, or even teachers within a school, using the language of levels and actually using them to mean quite different things because of this issue. So I don't think prose descriptors are helpful for an accurate shared meaning. Are they helpful for helpful next steps? So you might say, well, okay, I don't get that level of precision that you need for summative assessment, but surely they can be helpful for something like formative assessment, that they give me and my pupils an understanding of where they need to go. And I'd argue, no, they don't do that very well either. So this is a nice quotation from Dylan William. He says, I remember talking to a middle school student who was looking at the feedback his teacher had given him. The teacher had written, you need to be more systematic in planning your scientific inquiries. I asked the student what that meant to him, and he said, I don't know. If I knew how to be more systematic, I would have been systematic the first time. And again, when I read that for the first time, I cringed because I thought of all the times I'd given feedback that was of that order of vagueness and genericism. And the ones I was always guilty of were the ones that you get, if anybody remembers the old APP grids, the National Curriculum Level APP grids. There were ones for reading in particular which were enormously unhelpful, which were things like, well, pupils at this level can infer insightfully. So if you're giving a pupil feedback saying, to get to the next level, you need to infer more insightfully, what does that mean? What are they going to do differently as a result of that feedback? And that's the point Dylan William makes here. He says this kind of feedback is accurate. Okay, it's true. It describes what needs to happen. It does need to be more systematic. You do need to infer better. But it's not helpful because the learner doesn't know how to use the feedback to improve. It's like telling an unsuccessful comedian to be funnier. It's accurate, but it's not particularly helpful advice. And I think, again, it goes back to some of the things I'm saying about formative assessment, is that that if we, and the things I say about Erickson and the deliberate practice, is that in order to work out what would be helpful and what would be a thing that the pupils could do that would help them improve, that's where we have to go back into unpacking what does it take to be more systematic? What does it take to infer more accurately? What are the things you have to do? What are the actual steps? And Dylan William calls that a progression model, a model of progression. And he talks about it a lot in the context of sport. He talks about baseball players, where a good coach will have in their head, he says, not just quality, but the anatomy of quality. The steps that it takes to get you from one level to another, the things that you will do. And what is also important there is those things will not be prose statements. And that was something I think the video I saw just now expressed really well, the video by, about the computing multiple choice questions, is there was a really good thing about there about how the questions enact the curriculum. The questions embody the curriculum. And when you have a set of prose statements, you need something more specific to make those statements come alive and to avoid the ambiguity. And so that's why I thought those computing questions, that's exactly the kind of approach that I think does give you the more helpful next steps. And that brings me on to what I want to talk about next, is that I've said don't use descriptors, either for formative or summative assessment, but I don't want to be negative. I'd like to present some solutions. So what are the solutions? These would be my solutions. I'm not going to talk about the summative ones because we're not in a discussion about summative assessment. I'd put them up there just because, for balance, to say what would you do for those. So I would separate out the kind of tasks that are used for formative and summative assessment. That's not to say, definitely you can get some summative information from questions that are designed for formative purposes. You can also get some formative information from questions that are designed for summative purposes. But if I was imagining a Venn diagram, there'd be a bit of an overlap, but it's not a total overlap. And I think the route we've got into now is that a large proportion of the formative feedback we give children is based on their performance on summative tests. So all the feedback is coming from the GCSE past paper. And my argument would be that we need a lot more tests that are not designed for summative purposes to help us with those formative tasks. So the two suggestions I've put up there for how can we measure formative assessment, what can we do for formative assessment, I've said multiple choice questions and vocabulary. And actually, in my distinction here, I'm actually, I think, flipping, I think, sometimes the common understanding of formative and summative. A lot of the time when I'm in schools and talk to teachers, I think there's a feeling that formative is the thing that should be maybe authentic and very rich and very real life. And summative assessment is the nasty, rigorous, cut and dried, precise thing. And actually, I'd flip that around a little bit. I think if we accept what Erickson's saying about deliberate practice, then formative assessment probably shouldn't be authentic. Formative assessment should be something where you are breaking things up into small chunks. It isn't authentic. And similarly, if summative assessment, if we take my point as well about how summative assessment should be, I think, it's the complex skill, it should be as close as possible as we can get within bounds to more real-world authentic tasks. And that's why I'm not going to discuss it today, but that's why I'm so interested in comparative judgment, because comparative judgment gives you a reliable way of measuring some of those authentic tasks. So, and that's why also you might be surprised to see that I've put multiple choice questions, MCQs, underneath the heading formative. And the reason I've done that, in multiple choice questions often are seen, they have a bad reputation, people don't like them. And I think there's a couple of reasons they have a bad reputation. One is they're often not done well. I'm going to show you an example of that on the next slide. But another reason they get a bad reputation is I think they're often used for summative purposes, and then you get into all these awkward things about how they can be gamed, and you end up with teachers using them, preparing children to answer them, which is nothing you'll ever have to do in the real world, and it can become very soulless. And certainly I think in America there's a lot of work on how that's gone wrong. I think the real power of a multiple choice question is for formative purposes, because they allow you to home in on these misconceptions really effectively. So I'm going to have a look now at the multiple choice questions, and I'm really glad I followed on from that video. I love that question, which number is bigger? That's a great question, and that's teasing out a misconception. I've got a similar one to show you in a moment. Okay, so multiple choice questions, let's have a look at them. I've got two questions here. And I must say, I had set up this slide to fly in so we could have a go at this, but it appears the formatting's not worked. So it's not going to work as well. I was going to hope to get you to do this task yourself, but unfortunately the formatting seems to have changed. So I've got two multiple choice questions here. On the left-hand side, we have what is the capital of Moldova? And I hope you can see that on the left-hand side, I've put a red box around the four distractors, the 4 wrong answers. And I'm saying the question on the left is a better multiple choice question. And the reason why it's a better multiple choice question is that the distractors, that is the things in the box in red, they are unambiguously wrong, but they're still plausible. So again, if I've been able to do this task with you, and we've done it as a group, what normally happens, if I give people that first question, I say, what's the capital of Moldova, and give them those 5 options, and I ask people to put their hands up, what happens is people are just a sea of different numbers. People tend to not know the answer to that question when they're given it in that format. When I give people the second question, everybody magically seems to know the right answer. And why is that? It's because the distractors on this example are unambiguously wrong, but they're not plausible. And people know that Paris and London are not the capital of Moldova. So this is quite a silly example, but it's proving a point I hope that you'll see, which is that the multiple choice question, the quality of it depends to such a large degree on the distractor. And designing and sourcing good distractors is really hard. So again, we completely agree with, I think, the person in the previous video who was saying creating good questions is hard. Yes, it is. It's really hard. And the reason why, again, I like multiple choice questions is it is really hard to create a good multiple choice question. And the reason why people end up doing things like this and why multiple choice questions get a bad rap is I think teachers are tired, they're rushing, I've been in that situation, and you think, oh, what can I come up with? I need a capital. What can I put down there? And you put things that are just not plausible. And they don't really tell you what you need to know. So I love the idea of crowdsourcing multiple choice questions, because the other great thing about multiple choice questions is, unlike essays, every time you set an essay question, you have to mark it. So you can set an essay question really easily. It's not hard to set an essay question. It's really hard to mark it. And every time you set it again, you've got to mark it again. With these kind of questions, yes, they are hard to set, but that upfront effort is an investment, because you can use and reuse the question. And I absolutely think that if we can get platforms of questions, like we saw in the previous video, then we can get into a situation where we've got thousands of them, thousands of high quality questions. And if one teacher agrees to create 10 or 15 or 20, that then gives them access to the 10 or 15 or 20 that every other teacher out there has created. That's an amazing resource. So the fact is that, yes, they take work to put together, but it's an upfront investment, and they will keep repaying that investment in a way that essay questions won't. So those are some multiple choice questions. Here's another example. And again, sorry, the formatting here seems to have gone wrong. But this is a nice example. What is 20% of 300? And I think one of the things that I think I got this question from Diagnostic Questions, which was, again, on the previous video. But what's great about, if you set up the distractors to be really good ones, you can target common misconceptions, and you can identify the kind of errors that pupils are falling into. So this is a great question. 15 is very often the wrong answer here. And why do pupils put 15? Well, again, I think Diagnostic Questions gets pupils to type in the reasons why they put certain answers. And there is a common pupil misconception, which when you think about it is quite logical, that if you work out 10% by dividing by 10, you can work out 20% by dividing by 20. And you can see if a pupil's learnt the shortcut, 10% divided by 10, 10% is such a common percent, they might have done that quite a few times, got it right. They then think, oh, how do I do 20% divided by 20? So that's something that multiple choice questions, and again, multiple choice questions at scale can help you with. And I've put a quotation up on the right-hand side from Dan Willingham. He said that students learn more when their teachers know the content and when they can anticipate student misconceptions. So there's a whole body of research on what I think Willingham and others have termed pedagogical subject knowledge. So subject knowledge is knowing that 20% of 300 is 60. Pedagogical subject knowledge is knowing that if you ask a 12-year-old that question, a lot of them will say 15, and that's one of the reasons why. So someone who's got subject knowledge can tell you the right answer. Someone who's got pedagogical subject knowledge can tell you what the wrong answer is, what the typical wrong answer is, and why pupils will put that. And, even better, what to do next. So that's an example, I think, of how multiple choice questions can really help. So I'll move on to the second example I had now. And I just want to check our time. Sorry, how are we doing for time? Because I know we've Going to past, or is it here? It's here. Oh, great, brilliant, great. Brilliant. So I will whiz through this final example of how I think you can teach and assess vocabulary. And I'm basing a lot of this on a really good book, a very practical book by a woman called Isabel Beck. It's called Bringing Words to Life, Robust Vocabulary Instruction. I really recommend it, very practical. And she talks a lot about how you teach vocabulary and how you can assess vocabulary. And she has some slightly counterintuitive ideas about how you might do that. She recommends not using definitions, for example. She recommends teaching words through examples and through lots of examples in different contexts. But she also recommends not using naturally occurring contexts for examples, because those examples can be misleading. So I've got a few examples of what she talks about. She also gives recommendations about the types of words you should teach. So she talks about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 words. Tier 1 words are very basic, everyday words. You don't need to bother teaching those. Tier 3 words, very rare and subject-specific words. She also says actually they're less important. And her focus is all on these tier 2 words. And again, where I would say this ties into some of that deliberate practice idea is that her point is vocabulary is the building block of so much else. It's the building block of good reading, but it's also the building block of understanding in an awful lot of subjects. And this is her sort of process for teaching a word. Choose a valuable word, give different examples, give a simple definition, get pupils to create a sentence, and you can do a sort of thumbs up, thumbs down sentence to assess that. And you can also, sort of whizzing through these now, you can combine multiple choice questions and vocabulary. And she talks about this a bit in her book too, that you can identify, you can do some of that as well. So that's a whistle-stop tour through why I think we should separate formative and summative assessment, why I think they need to be measured in different ways, and then a couple of really brief examples of practical ways in which we can do that. So multiple choice questions and vocabulary. And I've got 13, 12, 11, I've got a clock flashing at me. So have we got time for questions, or? No, we'll finish now. We'll do the discussion later. Great. So I hope you enjoyed that, and any questions you can do in the panel later. Thanks very much. Cheers.